Picture London in the year 1665, a city full of life noise and bustling energy. It was a metropolis of trade where the streets echoed with the sounds of merchants haggling and carts rumbling through narrow lanes. The air was thick with the scent of spices from the East Indies' freshly baked bread and the salty tang of the Thames River. The city was alive with promise, a crossroads where people from all corners of the world met to exchange goods, ideas, and hopes. But beneath the bright surface of London, a darker story was unfolding. As vibrant as London was, there was an undercurrent of tension. The streets teemed with life, some living in wealth and luxury, while others crowded together in damp, overstuffed tenements struggled for survival. For the rich life was full of fine dining silk garments and palatial homes. But for the poor, every day was a fight. Their homes crammed into the slums of the city were vulnerable to disease, poverty, and squalor. Yet even in this thriving city, something ominous lingered in the air. It was not the buzz of the markets or the chatter of the streets that was most present. It was the silent, creeping fear that hung over everyone, even as they went about their daily routines. The fear that death might strike at any moment unseen and uninvited, not in the form of battle or accident, but through a deadly, invisible enemy disease. In the high streets, wealthy families went about their business, their lives full of the latest fashions, large meals, and meetings with friends. In contrast, the poor huddled in filthy conditions in overcrowded homes with barely enough food to get by. Yet despite the glaring differences, both groups shared something in common, a growing sense of unease. London, with all its energy and vibrancy, was slowly being overshadowed by a fear that no one truly understood. It started quietly. It wasn't the grand announcement of a war or a dramatic sudden disaster, but rather a quiet and creeping presence that snuck into the cracks of daily life. A few isolated deaths, a couple of strange illnesses, nothing out of the ordinary. The people of London had seen sickness before, especially during the winter months when the cold seemed to breed disease. Typhus, smallpox, and consumption were all too familiar, but this time it was different. This illness was more insidious, its symptoms terrifyingly unfamiliar. The first deaths were attributed to fever, or perhaps something more benign, but something about these deaths lingered in the minds of those who noticed. The swelling, the painful bumps in the groin and armpits, the fever that burned hotter than anything seen before. These were the unmistakable signs that the plague had returned. In the poor district of St. Giles, the early whispers were not about a plague, but about the cold or some strange fever. No one dared to name it, not yet. Acknowledging the plague meant sealing off homes, isolating families, ruining lives, and inciting panic. And so the authorities turned a blind eye, and the people hoped it would pass. But the deaths continued. At first it was one or two people in a neighborhood, then more. People fell ill, their loved ones becoming strangers as fever ravaged their bodies. Fear spread not just in the slums, but among all classes. Still, no one dared to speak the word plague, for it was more than just a disease, it was a death sentence. For the wealthy, it was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was a slow, creeping terror. The streets of London, once filled with laughter and music, now began to grow eerily silent. Before we dive deeper into the tragedy and resilience of this dark time, don't forget to like this video. If you're enjoying our journey into history, share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories like this. Now let's continue. As the weeks went by, the plague spread like a shadow, creeping into the hearts of the city. What had started in the dark alleys of St. Giles began to take root in the heart of London itself. Families were struck down, and whispers of death echoed through every street. And as the city struggled to cope with this new invisible enemy, its people could only wait and wonder. Was this the beginning of the end? The winter of 1664 arrived like a dark, uninvited guest in London. Instead of the crisp white beauty of a true winter, the city was draped in gray, oppressive clouds that hung low, blocking any glimpse of the sun. The wind whipped through the narrow streets, carrying with it a biting cold that cut through even the thickest of coats. There was no relief to be found, no crackling warmth of hearth fires that could push the chill out of every corner of the house. The weather matched the mood of the city, bleak, uncertain, and heavy with the foreboding of what was to come. The poor districts of London, particularly places like St. Giles in the Fields, were the hardest hit. These areas, located outside the safety of the Roman walls, had grown haphazardly over the years. The streets were a labyrinth of poorly built homes stacked on top of each other, leaning in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The houses were packed so tightly together that sunlight barely made it through the narrow gaps between them, leaving the streets shrouded in perpetual gloom. Even during the day, the atmosphere felt like twilight. In St. Giles, families lived in overcrowded, damp conditions. Entire households crammed into single rooms, their bodies providing the only warmth against the icy fingers of winter that crept through the cracks in the walls. The rooms were often damp with the moisture from the air, the wet ground seeping through the timber floors. The smoke from sea coal fires hung thick in the air, making it hard to breathe, especially for the children. It was a constant battle to keep warm, and yet the cold managed to find its way in, no matter how many blankets they piled on their beds or how tightly they huddled together. The cold was always there, an ever-present presence. It was a time when privacy was a distant luxury, when entire families, sometimes several generations, shared the same small space. Children slept with their parents, the elderly with the young, all piled together on thin mattresses, huddling close for warmth, yet still feeling the weight of the cold creeping in. The very air in the rooms felt heavy with damp. The walls seemed to sweat from the humidity and the stench of unwashed bodies, the acrid smoke of burning coal, and the decay of the city outside clung to everything. There was no real sanitation in London's poorer quarters. The streets served as open sewers, with muck and waste flowing freely down the gutters. Foul-smelling cesspits overflowed, leaking their toxic contents into the ground and sometimes into the water people drank from. These living conditions, though harsh, were a way of life for the majority of London's population. For the people of St. Giles, sickness was an inevitable companion, something they had long since accepted. Typhus, smallpox, consumption. These diseases were familiar to them. Recurring visitors that seemed to come and go with the seasons, claiming lives in a steady, predictable rhythm. But as the cold of 1664 settled deeper into the bones of Londoners, something more sinister began to creep in, a sickness that at first went unnoticed. Death had always been a part of life in these districts, but now a new presence had arrived, one that would forever change the course of the city's history. It began quietly, a death here and a death there, unremarkable at first. In the parish records, the cause of death was always vague, always something other than what it truly was. The dreaded word was avoided at all costs. Plague was a diagnosis no one wanted to utter. To do so meant death, not just for the person afflicted, but for their entire household. A diagnosis of plague meant quarantine, it meant isolation, and it meant the fear of losing everything. When Richard Andrews, a local man, died in early December, the parish's searchers, the poor elderly women, paid to inspect bodies and determine the cause of death, hesitated to use the dreaded word. His wife, Rebecca Andrews, died shortly after him. Their deaths were recorded as other causes, anything but the truth. It was a denial, a desperate attempt to avoid the catastrophic implications of the plague. But the symptoms were too telling: high fever, delirium, and most telling of all, the swollen, painful buboes that appeared in the groin or armpits. Despite the murmurings of suspicion among those who saw the telltale signs, there was little urgency. After all, winter in London was already a time of illness. The city's streets were full of disease, typhus, influenza, and smallpox. People died regularly, and their deaths were often chalked up to the inevitable, to the diseases that plagued the city year after year. The people of St. Giles had lived with these afflictions for so long that they were almost part of the background noise of their existence. For several weeks, the plague seemed to have been smothered by the brutal cold of winter. The disease flickered briefly, like a candle flame in a draught, but just as quickly, it seemed to disappear. The city exhaled, if only briefly, in relief. Perhaps it had been a false alarm, a misdiagnosis, a fluke. The cold had smothered it, the people thought. The plague would wait. The city carried on. But what the people didn't know was that the plague was not gone. It was merely biding its time. Beneath the frozen surface of winter, the disease waited, a quiet predator, watching and waiting for the warmth of spring to awaken it once more. As the city remained in a deep collective breath, the rats in the dark corners of the streets, in the rafters of the houses, in the shadowy crevices of the city's warehouses, carried with them the bacteria that would soon make their presence known. The rats were not alone. They had brought with them something far worse: fleas, the true bearers of the plague. These fleas, so tiny, so seemingly insignificant, carried a deadly cargo, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the agent that would cause the Great Plague of London. The fleas would feed on the rats, and when the rats died, the fleas would find a new host. And when the plague made its move, it would begin to spread quietly and relentlessly. In the crowded slums of London, where the people lived in such close quarters, the conditions were perfect for the disease to take root and thrive. The people, already weakened by the cold and the other diseases that plagued the city, were vulnerable. The rats, the fleas, and the bacteria worked together in silent harmony, and the plague was already making its way through the city. It spread almost invisible at first. As the days passed, the first signs of the plague's return appeared. A few more deaths in St. Giles, a few in neighboring parishes. The fever and the swelling were unmistakable. But still, the authorities hesitated to name the plague. To do so would be to admit the city's vulnerability, to acknowledge that death had already crossed the threshold and entered the very heart of London. The city's economy, the lifeblood of its trade and commerce, could not afford to face such a truth. The plague, if confirmed, would spell disaster, panic, quarantine, and the collapse of everything they had worked to build. The Great Plague of London in 1665 had begun in the shadows, and like so many great disasters, it would be too late before the full weight of its presence could be truly understood. But for now, Londoners could only wait, still breathing a collective sigh of relief, thinking that winter had smothered the worst of it. What they didn't know was that the worst was only just beginning, and the city was about to face a reckoning it could not escape. When London huddled under the weight of a bitter winter, the cold seemed to be the only enemy the city had to worry about. It had smothered the usual feverish activity of the streets, silencing the sounds of labor and trade while the people huddled together, trying to stay warm in the damp, decaying homes that lined the narrow, congested streets. Yet what no one could know, what no one could see, was that an invisible, far more sinister enemy had already crossed the threshold of the city. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. A few isolated deaths here and there, attributed to the usual winter illnesses, typhus consumption, the flu. But something felt off, even if no one could pinpoint it. The deaths were more rapid than usual, more unexplained. People whispered of a new sickness, a fever that seemed to strike without warning, without mercy. But this was London after all, a city where disease was a constant companion, and the whispers were nothing more than the usual talk of cold winters and inevitable death. The authorities, as they always had, remained largely disinterested, focused more on maintaining order in a city rife with uncertainty than on the murmurings of sickness. After all, diseases like smallpox and typhus had plagued the city for generations. It was just part of life, part of the grime and grind of existence in a city that never seemed to rest, a city where death was an accepted part of the backdrop. But the truth was far more insidious, a creeping danger that moved quietly through the city streets, slipping through cracks in the walls and into the very air they breathed. This disease, unlike anything London had ever encountered, was invisible. It did not announce itself with the dramatic flair of a feverish cough or an immediate death. No, it moved in the silence of shadows carried by an army that went unnoticed until it was far too late. The rats had arrived, but these were no ordinary rats. They were travelers, seafarers in fact, having ridden into the city, along with ships that docked on the bustling riverfront of the Thames. The river had long been the lifeblood of London, the main artery through which goods and people flowed into the city. It was from this river that the black rats, along with their invisible passengers, came. These rats were far from the dirty scavenging creatures that wandered the streets. No, they were agile travelers at home on the ships that docked at the London wharves. Their fur was matted, their movements quick and sure. Their presence was hardly noticed as they scurried along the wooden decks, hiding in the shadows of crates and barrels, in the folds of damp sails, and in the dark corners of the ships. The merchants who unloaded their wares rarely gave them a second thought. They were simply a part of the chaos that defined London's trade. But unbeknownst to them, these rats carried something far more deadly than the common fleas they were so well known for. The fleas, which had long been a part of the rat's life, were more than just a nuisance. They were the true carriers of the disease that would soon ravage London. Tiny, seemingly insignificant creatures, they were the silent agents of destruction. These fleas had a singular purpose: to feed and multiply. And in their desperation for blood, they became vessels for the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the agent responsible for the plague. These rats and the fleas that infested them traveled in silence, unnoticed by the bustling life of the London docks. They mingled with the other rats, those that already inhabited the dark corners of the city. The docks, full of food and waste, were a paradise for these pests, their population growing at an alarming rate. The fleas, unnoticed, moved seamlessly between rat and occasionally the rat's human hosts. They leapt from rat to rat, feeding until they were sated, until they turned to another hungrier target, the people of London. The rats, now carriers of death, began to move deeper into the city, disappearing into the maze of alleyways and dark warehouses that populated the East End. The disease that had plagued other parts of Europe for years, mostly unnoticed and unnamed, had finally found its way to London, but its presence was still unseen. In fact, for weeks Londoners carried on with their lives, oblivious to the threat that had already taken hold. A man named Richard Andrews died in early December, his death recorded with little attention. The official cause of death, as usual, was something less alarming than the word plague. Perhaps it was spotted fever, or a mere case of the flu. He wasn't the only one. A few others, too, passed away during the cold winter, their causes of death listed as common ailments, nothing that raised any red flags. Their families, devastated, but not particularly alarmed, buried them without fanfare, without suspicion. In St. Giles, the disease slowly began to take root. One death followed another, but still there was no urgency, no recognition of the deeper threat lurking beneath the surface. The people of the parish had become so used to death that another one here and there hardly seemed out of place. But then something began to shift, something that no one had expected, something that could not be ignored. The cold of winter, it seemed, had smothered the disease. For a time at least, it had appeared to retreat, leaving Londoners to breathe a sigh of relief. The cold was their ally, they thought. They carried on with their grimy daily routines, thinking that perhaps the plague would simply stay away. But the disease was not gone. It was merely waiting. It was dormant, hidden away within its carriers, the fleas and the rats biding its time, until the warmer weather of spring arrived. And when it did, the plague would come roaring back. The city was unaware of the danger still lurking in its walls. The disease was spreading in the dark, unseen and silent, until the weather warmed and the plague would rise with it. The city's fate had already been sealed, yet no one knew it. The first deaths, like whispers, were lost in the noise of everyday life. It wasn't until spring arrived, and the plague made its deadly move, that the true scale of the catastrophe became apparent. By then, it was too late to stop. The disease had already embedded itself deeply in the fabric of the city. The rats with their insidious fleas had ensured that the plague would make its mark, its invisible army spreading through the city like a shadow across the sun. It would take weeks, even months, before the full horror would reveal itself. Until then, Londoners could only carry on unaware of the terrible truth that was silently making its way through their streets. The plague was already here. The city of London, heavy with winter's chill, seemed to have a brief respite in those early months of 1665, its usual gray fog mingling with the dull, icy air. People moved in their daily routines, bundled up in the best they could manage, trying to stave off the cold in whatever way they knew how. Streets were busy with the usual murmur of life carts clattering along the cobblestones, street vendors shouting their wares, children running with playfulness, still burning in their hearts despite the season. Life, though cold, felt normal. But what the citizens of London could not see, what they could not hear, was the quiet stirrings of a far darker reality, one that was about to awaken in full force. Hidden within the very heart of London's commercial hub, along the murky banks of the Thames, lay a secret that no one had yet detected. It was not a secret of human misdeeds or hidden conspiracies, but one far more insidious, a force of nature, silent and unrelenting, moving with stealth and subtlety. The rats and fleas, though dismissed by many as mere pests, were actually the true heralds of London's forthcoming doom. They arrived in the dark corners of the city, unnoticed by the busy merchants, the hurried workers, and even the housewives scrubbing the cold floors of their homes. The warmth of the winter season, unlike the usual biting cold that would have otherwise kept these invaders at bay, gave them new life. They thrived in the heated enclosed spaces of the ships, docked along the Thames. With London being one of the greatest trading hubs in Europe, the city's docks teemed with all manner of ships arriving from foreign shores. It was on these ships that the true invaders, the rats, had found their passage. These rats, not native to London, but seafarers who had been carried across great distances, arrived with the foreign goods that the ships brought. At first glance, these rats seemed no different from the many other rats that scurried through the city, foraging for scraps in alleyways and near food markets. But these rats were different. They had traveled far, carried with them by merchant ships, navigating the murky waters of the Thames. They were opportunists, and the docks were their haven. There, amidst the piles of grain flour and timber, the rats found perfect conditions to thrive, ample food, dark corners to nest in warmth. But these rats did not travel alone. They were accompanied by a more silent, more dangerous companion, their fleas. These fleas, seemingly harmless and unnoticed, carried the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis, the agent responsible for the bubonic plague. The rats, being agile climbers, navigated the ropes, beams, and crates of the ships with ease, and in doing so, they brought their fleas along with them. They lived in the shadows of the cargo holds and between the walls of the ships, unnoticed by the sailors, the merchants, or anyone else who came into contact with the goods being offloaded. The fleas themselves were small, nearly invisible to the naked eye, but their hunger was undeniable. They fed on the blood of the rats, and in doing so, they became infected with the deadly bacteria. As the rats scurried around the city, they carried these fleas with them, their bodies acting as unwitting vessels for the plague. But the fleas did not stay with the rats. In fact, they were often desperate for new hosts, and it was during this search for a meal that the disease would begin to spread. One can only imagine the silence with which these fleas moved, hopping from rat to rat, from ship to ship, and from the rats to unsuspecting human hosts. They clung to the rats, waiting for the right moment to jump off and latch onto something warmer, something more vulnerable. They hopped onto the clothes of the sailors as they offloaded their goods. They landed on the bundles of textiles, the crates of grain, and the wagons carrying supplies to the city, and from there, the silent journey of the fleas began, hopping off their rat hosts and onto the people of London, who remained blissfully unaware of the threat that was slowly creeping into their lives. It wasn't immediately clear to the people of London that anything was wrong. The cold, dark winter made it easy to ignore the signs of the invisible enemy creeping through their midst. The first cases of fever and illness were written off as the usual winter ailments, the coughs and chills that went around every year. But as more people began to fall ill, a sense of unease began to settle over the city, even though it was still not fully understood what was happening. It wasn't until the early deaths started to multiply that the true nature of the threat began to show itself. One man, Richard Andrews, died suddenly. Then his wife Rebecca followed soon after. Their deaths, as tragic as they were, did not immediately raise alarms. The cause of death was listed simply as fever, perhaps, or a mysterious ailment, anything other than the dreaded word plague. For the authorities and for the people, it was easier to deny the presence of something so catastrophic. To say plague would mean the shutting of homes, the quarantine of families, and the panic that would follow would be unimaginable. But there was something distinctly unusual about these deaths. The symptoms were troubling. High fever, delirium, and most notably, the painful, swollen lumps in the armpits or groin buboes, the telltale sign of plague. Yet no one dared to say it out loud. The word itself carried too much weight. To declare plague meant social ostracism, the destruction of livelihoods, and the collapse of communities. So the authorities did what they always did. In the face of something too terrifying to understand, they chose to ignore it. As the weeks passed, the plague moved with an eerie quietness through the streets of St. Giles and its neighboring areas. Though the deaths were still few and scattered, they were enough to stir whispers among those who paid attention to such things. Those in the know began to wonder if they were witnessing the beginning of something much darker. But for the most part, the people of London were in denial, believing that it was just another bad winter, another round of seasonal sickness that would pass. But the plague didn't pass. It waited. And as the spring began to thaw, the city's cold grip, the plague hidden within the rats' fleas, and the city's underbelly began to emerge with a deadly ferocity. It was at this point, when the warm weather finally arrived, that the disease would no longer be hidden in the shadows. It would move openly cruelly through the crowded streets of London, claiming lives at an alarming rate as the city finally realized the true horror it faced. By the time the city acknowledged what was happening, it was already too late. The rats and fleas had already done their work, silently spreading the plague throughout London, leaving behind a wake of death that would change the city forever. The plague slowly began to tighten its grip on the city of London. But the pulse of life in the streets remained as frantic and industrious as ever. The grand merchants made their deals. The ships docked, and the markets remained filled with traders haggling over their goods, unaware, or perhaps choosing to ignore the impending doom that loomed in the shadows. For many, life went on, and the winter that had come and gone, leaving the streets slick with mud and the air thick with the promise of spring, seemed to promise a new beginning. Yet the whispers of death, once faint, were beginning to creep louder, though the word itself, plague, remained conspicuously absent from the lips of the wealthy and powerful. The plague, as it moved silently from the poor districts of St. Giles, was already spreading unnoticed through the city. The initial deaths in December, though tragic, had been shrouded in secrecy. The word plague was never uttered by those who knew better than to speak it aloud. The cause of death was carefully masked fever consumption, a bad cold, anything other than the dreaded plague. As the days passed, the toll of death climbed, but the wealthy merchants, noblemen, and city officials continued to carry on their business as usual. They knew the consequences that would come with the word, the chaos, the ruin, and the panic. So they did what came easiest. They ignored it. In the heart of London, nestled among the imposing buildings and bustling marketplaces, the authorities were more concerned with the financial implications of acknowledging a plague than the welfare of the people. The city's lifeblood trade was a delicate balance. The docks, the warehouses, the open-air markets, and the flowing ships carrying goods from across Europe, Africa, and Asia. All of these were integral to the city's economic engine. London was a hub of commerce, and to admit that the plague had arrived would send a shockwave through the very foundations of that commerce. What would happen to the silk from Persia, the spices from the East Indies, the cotton from the Low Countries? The flow of goods would grind to a halt. Ships would not arrive. The markets would close, and the workers would retreat to their homes in fear. To admit the plague's presence was to admit the near collapse of the economic system. The mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was a man who understood the stakes. It was said that when first alerted to the potential threat of the plague, he dismissed it with contempt. "Pish," he muttered. "A woman could piss it out." His words, whether apocryphal or not, encapsulated the paralysis of the city's leadership. It was easier to deny the reality of the disease, to silence the growing panic among the populace, and keep the wheels of trade moving, than to face the terrible truth. The city was already facing a crisis, one that had come quietly and was beginning to spread like a quiet fire in dry brush. But it was a fire no one wanted to acknowledge, because to do so would be to surrender everything. The economy, the reputation of the city, the wealth of London's merchants, all were tied to the continued flow of business. What if the plague spread to the merchant class? What if the wealthy and powerful were struck down by the same disease that had ravaged the poor? The thought was too horrible to entertain, and so the authorities buried their heads in the sand. They focused instead on keeping the markets open, keeping the trade flowing, and maintaining the facade of normalcy. "We must remain calm," they advised, as though doing so would make the invisible enemy disappear. As the disease spread, the first murmurs of plague became more frequent. But still, the authorities clung to their denial, refusing to utter the dreaded word. Instead, they relied on euphemisms, as though using softer language could change the reality of what was unfolding. Fevers, they said. Dysentery, they muttered. Spotted fever, they called it. But everyone knew deep down what it was. The marks on the bodies, the telltale swelling of the lymph nodes, the delirium, these were all unmistakable signs of the plague. Yet despite the mounting evidence, the city's leaders held fast to their denial, desperate to avoid the inevitable panic that would sweep through London if the truth was revealed. The heart of London's trade was inextricably linked to its docks, the bustling center of the city's economy. The merchant ships that arrived from all corners of the world carried goods worth millions. They brought with them the finest silks, exotic spices, and the raw materials that fueled London's industrial base. These ships were the city's lifeblood, and to acknowledge the plague would mean putting a stop to the flow of goods. The docks, and by extension, the wealth of the city were at stake. Trade was not just an economic necessity. It was part of the very fabric of London's identity. The wealthy merchants, the artisans, the dock workers, each had a stake in keeping the economy moving. To admit that the plague had come was to face the reality that their livelihoods would be destroyed. Ships would not dock. Trade routes would close. The city would grind to a halt. It was easier to pretend it wasn't happening to convince the people that the illness was nothing more than an inconvenience. As the disease crept into the wealthy enclaves of the city, however, it became harder and harder to ignore. Rumors began to circulate. People whispered in the streets about the strange sickness spreading through the poor districts. The number of deaths continued to rise, but the authorities were determined to keep the city's pulse steady. Even as the city's wealthiest began to show symptoms, even as prominent citizens fell ill. The word plague was still avoided, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic deflection. The government's response was too little too late. Instead of taking action early on, instead of isolating the infected areas and shutting down the markets, the authorities chose to deny the problem. They gambled with the lives of the citizens, hoping the plague would either burn itself out or that the rumors would fade away. But the plague was not a passing storm. It was a slow-moving disaster, and the longer the authorities waited to act, the more damage it did. The city's wealthiest merchants, those with the means to escape, began to leave London in droves. They fled to their country estates, taking their families and their wealth with them, abandoning the city to the plague. The royal court, led by King Charles II, was the first to pack up and leave. His departure sent a clear message: if the king was fleeing, then the city was truly in peril. The wealthy, who could afford to escape, began to abandon their homes, and soon London's streets began to empty. But for those left behind, there was no escape. The poor, the sick, the working class all had nowhere to go. They were trapped in a city that had been slowly consumed by a plague. They had not been prepared for a plague that was allowed to spread because of the authorities' denial. As the city descended into chaos, the true cost of that denial became painfully clear. The wealthy may have fled, but for the rest of London, there was no escape from the coming storm. In the end, the authorities were forced to face the truth. The plague had arrived, and there was no longer any denying it. The damage had already been done. The disease spread rapidly, consuming not only the poor, who had been left vulnerable, but also the rich and powerful, who had attempted to ignore the truth. The city was infected, and there was no turning back. It was a hard lesson for the authorities to learn. In their fear of economic ruin, they had allowed the plague to spread unchecked. The price of their denial was paid in lives, as the disease continued to claim victims at an alarming rate. For the citizens of London, it was a grim reminder that sometimes no amount of denial can stop the inevitable. The plague had come, and it would take its toll on the city, its people, and its economy. The bitter winds of December 1664 blew through the streets of London, and there was a quiet unease that began to seep into the very bones of the city. The cold was harsh, the skies were perpetually overcast, and the fog that hung heavy over the Thames seemed to hold an ominous weight. People went about their daily business, trying to find warmth in crowded, damp homes, their breath fogging in the chilled air. It was another winter in a city accustomed to hardship, but beneath the usual struggles of life, poverty, overcrowding, disease, there was something darker brewing, a quiet, invisible force moving through the slums slowly tightening its grip. In the impoverished parish of St. Giles in the Fields, life had always been hard. Its narrow alleyways choked with refuse, and the stench of decay were home to families crammed into tiny rooms struggling to survive. It was here in these back streets that Richard Andrews first succumbed to the disease that would ravage London in the months to come. His death was not in itself particularly alarming. Death was a constant in these streets, a natural consequence of the squalor and neglect that defined life in this part of the city. But there was something different about Richard's illness, a suddenness and a severity that set it apart. Richard had been a strong man, a worker who had known the hard grind of labor, and yet in the span of a few days he fell ill with a fever so high it seemed to burn him from the inside out. His wife Rebecca was the first to notice that something was horribly wrong. He was delirious, speaking in fragments, his body racked with shaking chills and bursts of fever. His once healthy skin turned pale and clammy, a sickly sheen covering his face. It was not like any illness she had seen before. She called for help, but there were no doctors, no proper healers to turn to in this part of town. "Richard, my love, what's happened to you?" she would cry, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, but he could hardly respond. His eyes were glazed over, his breath shallow and labored. The neighbors whispered, as they always did, but no one spoke the dreaded word. Not yet. But then it came the swellings. At first, it was only a small bump in his groin, easily dismissed as something that could be ignored. But as the fever raged, the small bump grew rapidly, swelling into a large, painful lump. The kind of swelling that no one had seen in recent memory. The kind of swelling that marked the return of something terrible, the plague. But no one dared speak of it. Not even the searchers, those poor women assigned to identify causes of death, could bring themselves to utter the word that haunted their very souls. Plague. It was too much, too devastating. So they called it something else, anything else. Perhaps they thought it was just a bad fever, or some other illness that could be explained away. But deep down, they knew. Rebecca's grief turned into fear as Richard's condition worsened. There was nothing she could do, nothing anyone could do. Soon, Richard's body grew cold, and with it, so did Rebecca's hope. His death was the first of many, though no one recognized it as such at the time. It was only a matter of days before more bodies began to pile up in the streets, each death marked by the same symptoms: fever, delirium, and swelling. In St. Giles, the poor families began to whisper amongst themselves. What was happening? It wasn't the usual round of illnesses that plagued them. Typhus, smallpox, consumption. These were familiar enemies. But the swollen groins, the painful lumps under the armpits, the high fevers that seemed to burn with such intensity, these were not familiar at all. Still, the authorities continued to avoid the truth. No one in power would acknowledge what was happening. They were afraid of the consequences: economic ruin, panic in the streets, loss of control. The disease, after all, had always been a part of life in London. It was a disease that could be swept under the rug for a time. There were more pressing matters, like trade, like maintaining the status quo, like keeping the city's pulse steady. But as the days wore on, more families fell ill. As each death was marked with the same signs, the fever, the delirium, the swellings, there could be no more denying it. In the quieter, poorer corners of London, the disease spread like wildfire. It crept into the alleyways, infecting families who had nowhere to hide, nowhere to flee. The most vulnerable were, as always, the first to fall victim. By the time February arrived, the disease had moved beyond St. Giles, creeping through the city in silence, spreading its invisible wings like a shadow. The dead began to pile up, but still the authorities refused to name it. The word plague was never spoken in official circles. It was avoided as though the mere utterance of it might be enough to make it real. And so the city lived in denial, even as it crumbled from the inside out. One of the earliest recorded deaths of the plague was that of a man in St. Giles, a poor laborer who had lived on the fringes of society, just another name in the sea of forgotten Londoners. His death, like Richard Andrews', was quickly attributed to fever exhaustion or some other convenient cause. But those who knew better, those who had lived through previous outbreaks, could feel the fear creeping in. By March, there could be no doubt. The plague was here. Yet the authorities continued to avoid the term, clinging to their hope that it would somehow pass, that it was just another fever that would burn itself out. They could not allow the fear to spread to the rich, to the traders, to the merchants who relied on the city's economic vibrancy to survive. But death, as it always does, came for everyone. It did not discriminate. As the first deaths were quietly buried, more bodies began to pile up in the streets. More families were struck down. The city's public health system, already strained, could not handle the influx of bodies. The hospitals, the burial grounds, everything was overwhelmed. And still, no one spoke the word plague. Instead, the records continued to list vague causes of death: disease, fever, infection. But as more deaths occurred, the word could no longer be avoided. The disease, already deeply entrenched in the poorer districts, began to spread to the wealthier parts of London. As the rich merchants and nobles began to fall ill, panic set in. But for the families in St. Giles, for those living in the overcrowded tenements and squalid homes, the plague was not a distant threat. It was already here. They lived it every day. The poor, who had already faced the worst of London's diseases, now found themselves up against something far more terrifying, something invisible, deadly, and unstoppable. They were the first to suffer, and they were also the first to be ignored by the authorities. And so the plague spread its invisible tendrils, weaving through the city as death claimed one soul after another. It was no longer a distant fear, it was a reality. And as the city clung to its denial, it moved closer to the inevitable truth. The plague was here, and it was not going away. The slow unfolding of the plague in spring was marked by a subtle shift in the rhythm of life in London. As the cold of winter receded and the first hints of warmth touched the city, there was a momentary sense of relief, a feeling that the worst had passed. The bitter winds that had kept the streets damp and heavy with the weight of winter now softened, and the sun began to show itself more frequently, casting long, pale rays across the rooftops. London's busy streets, usually filled with the clatter of carts' voices and the rumble of trade, seemed to wake with the change in season. But what was emerging alongside the fresh air of spring was something far more insidious, a creeping presence that no one could escape. The poor neighborhoods, St. Giles Drury Lane, the winding alleys of the East End had already borne the brunt of what Londoners feared might be the plague. The first deaths, so quietly recorded, seemed to disappear into the vast city's collective consciousness. Perhaps it was just another fever. Perhaps it would go away on its own. But as March turned into April, the pattern that had once been so faint began to grow unmistakable. There was no longer any denying it. The disease that had quietly taken hold in the city was not a fleeting visitor. It was a relentless force, a shadow that crept forward with the changing season, just as nature itself began to stir. As the spring sun began to warm the city, the streets were no longer just wet from rain. They were also filled with the stench of decay, with the smell of death, slowly rising like an invisible cloud over London. The disease spread more rapidly now, feeding off the warmth, the sudden temperature change that allowed the fleas, the true carriers of the plague, to thrive. The rats, those shadowy creatures that had long been a part of the city's underbelly, became more active, as if waking from their winter dormancy. And with the rats came the fleas, their tiny, insidious bodies carrying the plague from one victim to another. "Something's not right," murmured Eleanor, as she walked along the streets of St. Giles, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes, usually bright with the optimism of the season, now darted nervously from side to side. The world around her had begun to change, and she could feel it deep in her bones. It wasn't just the weather that felt different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. She had heard the whispers of more deaths in the neighborhood, each one followed by the telltale signs, fever delirium, and the dreadful swellings that no one could ignore. It wasn't the fever anymore. It was the plague, and the realization was sinking in, slow and heavy, like the weight of a nightmare that wouldn't let go. In the warmer months, the city should have felt alive with energy, but instead, it was suffocated by the slow realization that the disease had come for them all. The familiar sounds of London horses trotting through the streets, the chatter of the marketplace, the cries of vendors were drowned out by a new, more ominous sound, the constant tolling of church bells. A toll that had once signaled nothing more than the passing of time now became the mark of death itself. Each ring was a cruel reminder that another life had been claimed, another family torn apart. For the residents of St. Giles and the surrounding areas, it was as though the very heartbeat of the city had shifted from the pulse of commerce and life to the hollow beat of mourning. "The plague," muttered old Margaret, a woman who lived in the narrow alley behind the bakery, her face worn and creased by years of hard living. "It's here. It's here to stay." Her voice was a low rasp, filled with the certainty of someone who had seen too much of life's darker side. Margaret's words were not just a statement of fact. They were an acceptance of the inevitable, a grim acceptance that the world they once knew had begun to unravel. It wasn't just the poor who suffered now. The disease had begun to creep into the heart of the city, reaching the merchants, the traders, the upper-class families who had lived in relative ignorance of the suffering in the slums. As the days grew warmer, the number of deaths began to rise dramatically. The usual patterns of sickness, typhus consumption, the occasional bout of smallpox seemed to pale in comparison to the growing tide of plague. The wealthy, who had always maintained a careful distance from the poverty-stricken areas, now found their world beginning to crack. Their servants fell ill, their children grew feverish. The disease, which had seemed so far removed, had breached the walls they had built to protect themselves. "I told you," one of the merchants said to his wife, panic rising in his voice as he stared at the growing number of deaths around them. "I told you we shouldn't have let them dock the ships from Amsterdam." I knew this was coming." His wife, pale and silent, didn't reply. What could she say? The truth was undeniable now. The city's fate had been sealed by the invisible arrival of the plague, and no amount of wealth, no amount of distance could protect them. For those in the poor districts, like St. Giles, the arrival of the plague was not a surprise. The signs had been there for months, if anyone had cared to look. The deaths quietly recorded and buried were the beginning of something much more terrible. It was only in spring, when the city began to thaw, that the true scale of the plague's reach became undeniable. What had been a small contained outbreak was now a full-scale epidemic, spreading from parish to parish, crossing boundaries of class and wealth, leaving devastation in its wake. The slow and steady increase in deaths was both terrifying and maddening. People no longer questioned whether the plague had come. They only wondered how long it would take for it to reach them, for it to claim them as it had claimed so many others. The once bustling streets of London were now eerily empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. Those who had the means to flee had already gone. The aristocrats, the merchants, the politicians, anyone with enough resources to escape the encroaching danger had fled to the countryside, leaving behind the poor, the sick, and the desperate. And still, the plague continued to spread, undeterred by the fleeing rich, unaffected by the measures taken to contain it. It moved as a shadow growing darker with each passing day, feeding off the warmth of spring and preparing to claim yet more lives before the city could even begin to comprehend the magnitude of its destruction. The realization was sinking in that this was not just another seasonal disease that would pass when the weather changed. This was something far worse, a plague that could not be ignored or denied, a force that would change the very nature of London, leaving its mark for generations to come. As the warm spring days gave way to summer, the city's fate seemed sealed. The first signs of panic had begun to appear. The wealthy who had fled had now seen the truth. The plague was not a distant problem for the poor. It was a citywide catastrophe that would affect everyone, from the highest lords to the lowest beggars. And as the bells tolled and the bodies piled up, the people of London could do nothing but wait, caught in the grip of a disease they could neither understand nor stop. The city had entered a new season, one where fear and uncertainty ruled the streets and survival had become the only goal. The plague, once a distant terror, was now at their doorstep, and the slow unfolding of its presence would change everything. The city, once buzzing with the life of traders, craftsmen, and merchants, had now fallen silent, wrapped in an oppressive haze of fear. The plague, which had once seemed like an isolated incident, was now a citywide disaster, its invisible grip tightening with each passing day. The death toll, which had been creeping up in the spring, now surged, its numbers swelling with terrifying speed. In the narrow, cobbled streets of London, the plague's shadow cast its dark presence over everything. By early summer, the bills of mortality, those weekly reports of death, became a grim record of the city's downfall. No longer did they merely report the usual causes of death, fevers, consumption, or even the occasional smallpox. Now, the deaths attributed to the plague were climbing with terrifying regularity. The numbers that had once been counted in the dozens had escalated to the hundreds, and soon they were recorded in the thousands. At first, Londoners had tried to brush it off. People had always died in large numbers, especially in the squalid, overcrowded districts. It was part of life, or so they thought. But now, with the sudden escalation in deaths, whispers of panic began to fill the air, replacing the once lively chatter of street vendors and traders. People could no longer ignore the signs. The dead were no longer the poor or the sickly. Now the plague was striking the healthy, the young, and the strong, leaving families in ruins. It began subtly. A few families, terrified by the spread of the disease, packed up their belongings and fled. Their departure went unnoticed. At first, their absence easily explained away as a temporary retreat to the countryside. But soon more followed. Merchants, traders, and anyone with the means to leave found themselves suddenly possessed by a deep, overwhelming fear. "Get the carriage ready, Lydia," cried Edward, a wealthy merchant, his voice laced with panic. "We cannot wait another day. The city is dying. We must leave. Now." Lydia, his wife, could hardly believe what she was hearing. The streets had been quiet for weeks, but they were still home. This was their city, after all. Yet the fear in her husband's voice was palpable. There was no mistaking it. The plague was real, and it was closing in on them. She nodded silently, and together they hurried to pack their things, abandoning their luxurious home and their life in London for the uncertainty of the countryside. In the coming days, more followed. London's wealthy, its elite, began to evacuate in droves, leaving the city to its own devices. The sight of horse-drawn carriages packed with valuables and families fleeing the city became common. The roads leading out of London, once filled with the steady hum of trade, now became clogged with carriages, horses, and carts. The exodus of the rich signaled the beginning of a mass migration, a flight for survival. "God save us," murmured Thomas, a laborer watching from a doorway as a convoy of wealthy merchants sped past him. The dust from the wheels settled over the empty cobblestones, and the sound of hurried hooves echoed in his ears. There was no denying it. Now the elite were leaving, and they weren't looking back. Thomas, along with his family, could only watch in stunned silence. They had nowhere to go, no means of escaping the city. For the poor, there was no exit, no refuge. They were trapped. The tension in the streets grew palpable as the panic intensified. The authorities, who had initially downplayed the plague's severity, now scrambled to implement measures to contain the outbreak. But by this point, it was too late. The disease had already seeped too deeply into the fabric of London. No amount of regulation, no matter how harsh, could stop its spread. As the wealthy fled to the safety of their estates, the poor were left behind, bearing the brunt of the plague's wrath. In the town hall, Sir John Lawrence, the Lord Mayor of London, stood with his advisors, his face grave. "We must take action immediately. The streets are becoming deserted. The markets are collapsing. People are dying at a rate we cannot control," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of his responsibility. "We need to enforce quarantine measures immediately. Every parish should isolate the infected, and the searchers must work harder to identify those affected." But even as he spoke, Lawrence knew it was futile. The rats had already spread the plague through the city, and with them came the fleas that carried the deadly bacterium. Quarantine measures, isolation of the infected, and other regulations, all of it seemed like an afterthought. The disease had already spread too far. The city's bureaucracy, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster, could do nothing more than slow its progression, but not stop it. "We've already tried sealing up the infected houses," an alderman said, his voice trembling. "But it only makes it worse. The disease keeps spreading. It's everywhere." "And the rich are fleeing," another man said. "They're abandoning the city, leaving us all to deal with this mess." The city was slipping further into chaos. The wealthy had abandoned their posts, their homes, and the government had failed to keep order. As those with money escaped, the poor were left to suffer. They were trapped within the city, caught in the grip of a disease that no one fully understood. What was once a thriving, bustling metropolis had become a ghost town, its streets emptied by fear and the specter of death. In the markets, Vendors were abandoning their stalls, their goods left to rot. "It's no use," one baker said, his voice thick with despair. "Who will buy bread when everyone is dead? The plague has stolen our lives, and now it's stealing our livelihoods." As the number of deaths increased, so too did the panic. People no longer trusted one another. Neighbors who had once shared bread and salt now avoided each other at all costs. A cough could send a crowd scattering. People covered their faces with scarves, afraid that any breath from another could be their last. The city that had once been the heart of trade culture and innovation now resembled a war zone, its streets filled with nothing but fear, death, and desperation. "I can't stand it," said Agnes, a widow who had lived in the East End. "Everywhere you look, there's a death. My neighbors, my friends, they're all gone. What's left for us? What hope is there?" Agnes's voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of her grief too heavy to bear. She had lost everything, her home, her family, her sense of safety. Now, with the streets empty and the rich fleeing, there was only one thing left to do: survive if she could. But even that seemed impossible. The authorities' frantic scramble to control the outbreak was nothing more than a show for the remaining citizens. They could not stop the plague from spreading, and their attempts to contain it seemed more like a desperate effort to maintain order in a city on the brink of collapse. With each passing day, the death toll rose. It became clear the plague was not a brief episode to be managed. It was a force that would alter the course of London's history forever. The death rates continued to climb exponentially, and London's streets became a place of mourning and despair. The cries of grief echoed throughout the city as more families were decimated. What had started as a slow creep of disease had now transformed into an overwhelming wave of death, and nothing could stop it. As summer's heat bore down on the city, the plague grew even more intense, claiming more lives with each passing day. Fear spread faster than the disease itself, and Londoners were left to wonder how much longer they could hold on. The panic had reached its peak. The wealthy had escaped. The authorities were paralyzed, and the people were left to fend for themselves. London had become a city on the brink of collapse, and it was clear that the plague was not something that could be simply quarantined or stopped. It had come to stay, and no one was safe. But even as the streets emptied, even as the disease raged through the city, there was one thing that Londoners could still hold on to: their will to survive. They might have been abandoned by their leaders, but they would face the coming days together, trying desperately to navigate the horror of the plague that had turned their once thriving city into a wasteland of sickness, death, and fear. The air was thick with the sound of constant tolling bells marking the death of another soul claimed by the plague. London had become a city under siege, and its leaders, now frantic, began to enforce public health measures in an attempt to contain the invisible enemy that had taken so many lives. The Lord Mayor and his council had been slow to act, hoping the disease would pass, but now, with the streets emptying and death encroaching on every corner, they had no choice but to take action. Families were forced into quarantine, but not in the way one might think. It wasn't the clean, organized isolation of modern hospitals or containment zones. Instead, the quarantine was a brutal and unrelenting process. The city issued decrees forcing anyone suspected of carrying the plague, or anyone who had come into contact with the infected, into their homes. Their doors would be locked from the outside, their windows sealed. The families inside, already decimated by disease, would be left to suffer alone, cut off from the outside world. There was no hope of escape, no refuge to be found beyond their walls. "You will not leave until we say so," a stern official announced, his voice cold and unwavering. "Your house will be sealed, and you will remain inside." The red cross shall be painted upon your door, and no one shall come or go. The red crosses were painted on the doors of those who had been identified as infected, marking their homes with an ominous symbol of impending doom. The color, vivid and unmistakable, was a stark reminder of the horrors that awaited those trapped behind their walls. "Lord, have mercy upon us," was the haunting phrase written beside the cross. This inscription was a constant reminder of the fate that awaited everyone trapped inside. For Mary, a young mother who had been locked in her small home with her sickly children, the reality of her confinement was unbearable. She clung to her youngest daughter, Elizabeth, whose fever had reached an alarming height. Mary could hear the distant sounds of the dead cart, the cries of "Bring out your dead," and her heart would tighten in dread. It was only a matter of time before the cart would stop in front of her house, collecting her lifeless family, who would be discarded without ceremony. "We'll make it through this, won't we, Mother?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice fragile as she shivered beneath the thin blankets that couldn't keep the cold out. Mary held her daughter close, her heart heavy with guilt and helplessness. "I don't know, darling, but we must pray. We must hope." But hope seemed like a distant dream now. As the days stretched on, the symptoms of the plague became all too familiar. High fever, delirium, and the telltale sign, the bubo's swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck, marked a death sentence. Yet Mary knew what would happen next. She had heard it from others who had been in her position before the authorities would seal her house. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Inside these homes, isolation was not only a physical punishment, but an emotional one. The families locked inside were denied medical care and any hope of escape. The air was thick with fear and despair. The once bustling streets outside were now silent, save for the occasional rattle of the dead carts and the cries of the sick. There was no one to help those trapped inside. The searchers tasked with confirming the cause of death had their hands full. They were often poor elderly women who were paid a few pence for their grim work. Their diagnoses were based on little more than observation and folklore. "I don't care what they say," whispered one of Mary's neighbors, a woman who had seen many sick people before. "It's the plague. It's here, and we're all going to die. All of us." The grief in her voice was palpable. She had seen the signs. She had heard the rumors. But no one, not even the authorities, dared to say the word aloud, plague. To call it by its name was to acknowledge the unthinkable. The fear of the word itself was enough to paralyze a city, to send its citizens into a state of panic that overshadowed everything else. But as the days passed and the bodies continued to pile up, the grim reality became undeniable. The plague had spread, and it was spreading fast. The government's response was swift but ineffective. The authorities imposed quarantine measures and issued orders for sanitation. Yet the disease continued to slip through the cracks, moving from house to house, from street to street. The attempt to control the disease by locking families in their homes was a desperate but ultimately misguided effort. "They've locked us in, but we're all still dying," one man in the street muttered, staring up at the now closed house with the red cross painted on the door. His voice was hoarse from the cold, but his words were clear. The authorities thought they had contained the plague, but in truth, they had only pushed it further underground. Mary's family had been trapped for weeks now. Each day bled into the next, a grim routine of caring for her sick children, desperately trying to keep the disease at bay. The cold had seeped into their bones, the dampness from the walls pressing against them like an unrelenting force. Food was scarce, and her resources were running out. She couldn't even escape to find help, for the doors were locked and the authorities were not there to provide aid. They were too busy managing the dead, too busy enforcing their quarantines to offer any real assistance. I heard a man tried to leave his house yesterday. Another neighbor whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They saw him and they nailed the door shut right there on the spot. They wouldn't let him leave, no matter what. That was the nature of the quarantine. It wasn't just a precaution, it was a sentence. Once your house was sealed, there was no escape. You were at the mercy of the disease. And in Mary's case, that mercy seemed a distant hope. The process of quarantining was not a simple matter of keeping the infected away from the healthy. It was an act of containment that only served to isolate and exacerbate the problem. Those inside were trapped not only by the physical barricades, but by their own fear. No one could get in to help, and no one could leave to find refuge. As time went on, the terror in the city grew, as did the frustration with the authorities' inability to curb the spread. The wealthy had fled, retreating to their estates in the countryside, leaving the rest of the city to face its fate. The Red Cross, once a symbol of precaution, had become a harbinger of death. "We're dying," one of Mary's neighbors said as she looked up at the Red Cross on her door, tears streaming down her face. "We're all dying." It was an inescapable truth, one that no amount of denial could erase. The plague had arrived, and now it was here to stay. The sealed houses, the quarantine orders, the Red Crosses on the doors, none of it could change the fact that death was already among them. The disease didn't care about borders, about houses, or about quarantine orders. It moved where it willed, touching every corner of the city, leaving only death in its wake. Mary sat with her children, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. There was nothing left to do but wait. But in the silence of their home, broken only by the occasional cough or moan of pain, Mary realized just how powerless they all were. The authorities had tried to control the disease, but the disease had proven itself more powerful. It spread quickly, silently, and mercilessly. "I'm scared," Elizabeth whispered, clutching her mother's hand. "I don't want to die." Mary squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to offer comfort, even though she knew the truth. There was no way out. There was no escape. The plague had come, and it had come to stay. The sound of the dead cart, its wheels creaking as it made its rounds through the streets, was a constant reminder of the inevitability of death. And as Mary sat in her locked home, she knew that it would come for her family soon, just as it had come for so many others. The authorities had tried to lock away the plague, but in doing so, they had only given it a perfect breeding ground. The quarantines, the isolation, the sealed houses, none of it could stop the inevitable. The plague was in the city now, and no amount of bureaucratic measures could stop it. For the people of London, the Red Cross on their door was a symbol of finality. It marked the end, not just of their lives, but of their community. It was a death sentence, a reminder that they had already been claimed by the disease. The walls of their homes, once a place of comfort and refuge, now felt like tombs trapping them in the very place that had once offered protection. In the streets outside, life continued to grind to a halt. The panic had set in, and fear had become the currency of the day. The wealthy had fled, and the poor were left to face their fate alone. The city was crumbling under the weight of the disease, and the efforts of the authorities to contain it had only made matters worse. For Mary and her family, the door had been sealed, and the Red Cross had been painted on it. There was no escape. The disease had come, and it would not leave until it had taken everything. The bells tolled throughout London, not in celebration, but as a constant reminder of death's slow march through the city. The streets, once alive with merchants, street vendors, and the chatter of daily life, were now eerily silent. The Great Plague had taken hold, and with it a deep sense of fear that permeated every corner of the city. Yet amidst this growing despair, one group stood apart: King Charles II and his royal court. It was early July, and the heat in the city was suffocating. The air thick with coal smoke and the stench of decay hung heavily over the streets. The death toll had been rising steadily, and though the disease had spread rapidly through the poor districts of London, it was still largely confined to the working-class neighborhoods. But even as the plague's grip tightened on the city, the nobility, the wealthy elite, and the royal family made a decisive move. They fled. Charles II, the king who had seen his kingdom torn apart by civil war, who had lived in exile for years before regaining his throne, knew the importance of survival. He could not allow the plague to take him, not when his kingdom depended on his rule. With that thought in mind, he and his court left London in the early days of July. The king's departure was not a sudden decision. It had been coming for some time. There had been whispers in the royal court for weeks, rumors of the plague's spread, and suggestions that the king's presence in the city might endanger not only himself, but also the future of the monarchy. It wasn't a hasty escape. It was a calculated decision. Charles, along with his advisors, had prepared for this moment, making arrangements to leave London for the safety of the countryside. His destination, Hampton Court, a royal residence far removed from the infected city. There he would be free from the ever-looming presence of death that had settled over London like a dark cloud. The royal court, along with their staff servants and members of the aristocracy, followed the king, escaping to the relative safety of their country estates. But for those left behind, the king's departure was a bitter reminder of the divide between the rich and the poor. It was an unmistakable sign that the ruling class cared little for the lives of the common people. The wealthiest citizens, those with power and influence, could afford to leave. They had the means to escape the plague that was consuming the city. But for the rest, there was no way out. There were no country estates to retreat to, no grand carriages to carry them to safety. They were trapped. "Have you heard," said Mary, a seamstress, to her neighbor Jane as they huddled in the cramped alleyway outside their homes. "The king and all his court have fled. They've gone to Hampton Court, left us here to die." Jane shook her head, her face grim. "What else would they do? They've the means to escape, haven't they? Why should they stay and risk their lives with the likes of us?" Mary paused for a moment, looking out at the empty street. The silence was deafening, save for the occasional distant toll of a bell marking yet another death. "It's not right, though. They're supposed to be here to lead us through this, but they're abandoning us, leaving us to face it alone." The realization was a sharp blow. The poor, those who lived in the overcrowded and unsanitary neighborhoods, were left to fight the disease, with no resources, no protection, and no leadership. The wealthy had the means to protect themselves, to buy their way out of danger, but the rest had no such luxury. The working class, the laborers, the shopkeepers, the seamstresses, the street vendors, they were the ones who would face the brunt of the plague, and they would do so without the support of those who should have been guiding them through the crisis. It wasn't just the king who had fled. The wealthy merchants, the aristocracy, and even the clergy had made their plans to leave the city. The great houses along the Strand and Covent Garden were abandoned shutters, closed doors locked, and windows boarded up. The once thriving parts of London, where the rich and powerful had gathered, were now desolate. The streets were empty, and the silence was deafening. As the wealthy departed, the rest of London's population was left to contend with the reality of the plague on their own. There were no leaders to guide them, no resources to help them. The city's infrastructure was already stretched thin, and now with the exodus of the elite, there was no one left to maintain order. The poor were forced to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, the authorities in the city, led by the Lord Mayor, were scrambling to manage the crisis. They were trying to enforce quarantines, shut down public spaces, and impose curfews. But it was too late. The disease had already spread too far, and the measures were ineffective. The wealthy had already fled, and now with the streets empty and the markets closed, the city was left to implode. "Do you think they'll come back?" Jane asked, her voice filled with a mix of fear and resentment. Mary shook her head. "I doubt it. They've gone to save themselves, haven't they? We're on our own now." The reality of the situation was harsh. The poor had been abandoned by those who were supposed to protect them. They were left to face the plague, with no means of escaping the disease, no resources to help them survive. They were trapped in a city that had become a death trap, and there was no way out. As the days wore on, the number of deaths continued to rise. The Lord Mayor and his council, struggling to manage the disease, imposed harsher measures. Quarantines were set up, and houses marked with the infamous Red Cross were sealed. But the disease continued to spread. People were dying faster than the authorities could manage, and the death toll climbed to staggering heights. The panic that had been building for months finally reached its peak. For the poor, the departure of the king and his court was a stark reminder of their place in the world. They were disposable, their lives deemed less important than the lives of the wealthy and the powerful. The king's flight from the city was not just an act of survival. It was a symbol of the deep divisions that existed in London. As the rich escaped to the safety of the countryside, the rest of London was left to die. There was no mercy, no reprieve, only fear, and the overwhelming sense of abandonment. The city had become a graveyard, and those left behind were forced to face the disease alone. "We can't stay here," Mary said, her voice quiet, but filled with determination. "We need to get out. We need to leave before it's too late." But where could she go? Where could any of them go? There was nowhere left to run. The king had fled, the wealthy had fled, and the poor were left behind, trapped in a city that had become a tomb. There was no escape from the plague, no way to outrun it. The only thing left was to survive if they could. For Mary, for Jane, and for the rest of London's poor, survival meant more than just avoiding the disease. It meant finding a way to live in a city that had abandoned them, a city that had been left to rot from the inside out. And so they stayed huddling together in their small homes, praying that they could survive the terror that had taken over their world. The king and his court had fled, but for the rest of London, the plague was just beginning, and there was no escaping it. The only thing left was to face it head on, to survive if they could. The streets of London had become eerily silent, save for the occasional distant cry of the plague cart's driver calling out for those who had passed away. The city, once bustling with the vibrancy of trade, social gatherings, and commerce, was now a hushed graveyard, its lifeblood drained away by a deadly, invisible force. The high walls that had once separated the aristocracy from the rest of the population had grown even taller, but not in a way the wealthy might have hoped. The divide between the rich and the poor, already stark, had grown insurmountable. The poor, those who had no means of fleeing, were left behind, trapped in a city that had turned into a death sentence for many. As the plague spread, the wealthy had already packed their belongings, left their mansions, and disappeared into the countryside. London, the city of trade and culture, had become a forgotten wasteland for the working class, and for them, there was no escape. Mary, a seamstress, sat by the cracked window of her small, overcrowded room in the East End. Outside, the streets lay in an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the occasional sound of church bells tolling for yet another victim. Her children, thin from hunger, huddled together in the corner of the room, their faces drawn in exhaustion. The stench of decay seemed to hang heavy in the air, mixing with the soot from the unwashed chimneys, and she could hear the faint sound of rats scurrying through the walls. She had heard the news the rich had left, the king had left, and now they were all alone. "Ma, do you think it will come here?" asked young Tom, his voice a whisper, though there was no one else to hear. Mary didn't know how to answer him. There were no words that could ease the fear that clung to them like a second skin. She had heard the stories of the Red Cross of families being sealed in their homes to die. Those who had the means to flee had done so, leaving only those who could not, those who had nowhere to go. No money to get away, no way to escape the encroaching doom. "I don't know, love," she whispered, her voice tight with fear, "but we'll stay together and we'll face it together." But the cold, hard truth was that survival had become a luxury for the privileged. For those like Mary and her children, survival had become a matter of mere chance, a game of luck played against an unseen enemy. With no escape, they were forced to endure the overwhelming uncertainty of a city collapsing around them. As the days passed, the situation only worsened. The wealthy had fled to the countryside where they could take shelter in their grand estates. They were safe from the disease, from the overcrowded tenements, from the horror of seeing their neighbors succumb to the plague. The rich had the means to escape. They had the resources to buy safety. They had the freedom to go wherever they wished. But for Mary, for her children, and for the countless other poor souls who had no other options, there was nowhere to run. "The city's empty now, isn't it?" murmured Jane, Mary's closest friend and fellow seamstress. She sat beside her, her hands trembling as she tried to sew, though the task felt meaningless now. "The markets are closed, the streets are empty. We're all just waiting. We're all waiting for the end," Mary said softly, her eyes fixed on the half-finished work in her lap. It was as though the very weight of the city's despair had made it impossible for her to think of anything else. The working class had become invisible. As the streets emptied, as the plague tightened its grip, those who had once made the city hum with life street vendors, laborers, servants, were now nothing more than ghosts left to suffer in silence. The few who dared to go out were met with the suspicion of their neighbors, who feared they might be carrying the disease. The shops were shuttered. The markets had stopped trading. No one ventured outside except for the brave few who had no choice but to keep moving, searching for food or supplies, though there was little left to find. But it wasn't just the physical toll of the plague that weighed heavily on the poor. It was the emotional toll, too. The knowledge that they had been abandoned by those who should have cared for them. The wealthy had retreated behind their high walls, their mansions, their private estates. The king, the nobility, the merchants who had once flourished in the city, none of them had stayed to face the disease. Instead, they had packed up their carriages and fled. "Do you think they'll come back?" Jane asked, her voice breaking the silence. Mary didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what she would say. Could they come back? Would the city be the same when they did? Could they ever fix the damage that had been done, not just by the plague, but by the abandonment of the poor, the ones who had been left behind to fend for themselves? "They'll come back when it's safe for them," Mary finally said, bitterness creeping into her voice. "But we're the ones who will live or die here alone." As the days turned into weeks, the feeling of isolation became more suffocating. Mary would occasionally hear people muttering in the streets, voices tinged with fear and despair. People spoke of the Red Cross marks, the ominous signs that meant certain death. If a family had been struck by the plague, their house was marked with the Red Cross, and no one was allowed to leave. The city had become a place of imprisonment for those who were still alive, a slow, suffocating death that seemed almost as cruel as the plague itself. The contrast between the rich and the poor could not have been starker. The rich could buy their way out of the city, could retreat to places of safety, while the poor had nowhere to go, nothing to fall back on. The wealth gap had never felt wider, and now it had become a matter of life and death. For the poor, survival wasn't a matter of privilege. It was a matter of willpower, of holding on to whatever scraps of hope they could find. But hope was in short supply. Mary watched as more and more families fell ill. Each day brought new reports of death of neighbors who had been taken by the plague. The inevitable toll was taking its shape, and she feared it wouldn't be long before her family was added to the list. Each day, she held her breath, praying that her children, her family, would survive. But the weight of the situation was too much to bear. She could feel it in her bones. There was no escaping this. As the days turned to weeks, the cold grew colder. The winds that blew through the narrow streets of London seemed to carry with them the scent of death. The wealthy had left, but for those who remained, the end seemed inescapable. There was no way out, no escape. They were trapped, not just by the disease, but by the very system that had allowed it to happen. "I can't stay here," Mary Jane said one day, her voice filled with desperation. "We're going to die here. It's only a matter of time." Mary shook her head, feeling the weight of the words settle heavily on her shoulders. "We have no choice," she said softly, though the words felt hollow. "Where would we go? The whole city is dying. There's nowhere safe for us, no place where we can hide." Jane nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "But we're just waiting for it to come, just waiting for the end." It was the truth. For those left behind, survival was no longer a matter of hope. It was a matter of holding on, of trying to endure a world that had been abandoned by its leaders. And for Mary, it was a grim realization that the world she had known was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The plague had come, and with it, the divide between the rich and the poor had never seemed more insurmountable. The wealthy had fled, leaving behind those who had no escape, no means of survival. For the poor, survival meant holding on, clinging to the threads of life, with nothing but fear and resignation as companions. And so Mary and her children remained trapped in the city, waiting for the inevitable, hoping only that they would be among the lucky few who would survive. The streets of London were thick with the scent of smoke, decay, and something more sinister, a heavy, almost suffocating air that seemed to hang over the city like a shadow. The plague had already begun its deadly march across the city, leaving a wake of death and despair in its path. As the disease spread through the streets, it was not just the bodies of the poor and the sick that filled the streets. There was another presence, one that seemed to loom over the entire city like a dark specter, the figure of the plague doctor. Tall and gaunt, with a long, flowing coat that reached his ankles. The plague doctor was an unsettling sight to behold. His face was hidden behind a bird-like mask, its beak extended far in front of him, filled with fragrant herbs and spices. To the people of London, the mask was a symbol of protection, a barrier against the poisonous miasma they believed was causing the plague. But to the untrained eye, it looked like a grotesque and eerie thing, more akin to a creature from a nightmare than a medical professional. "Do you see him?" Mary whispered to her friend Jane as they watched from the window of their cramped room in the East End. The plague doctor passed by his figure, shrouded in the mist of the early morning fog, a dark silhouette against the pale light. "He looks like something out of a dream." Jane shivered. and nodded her hand instinctively, reaching for the cloth she had been using to cover her nose. "I heard he's supposed to help, but he looks so wrong. How does that mask even work?" "No one knows," Mary replied, her voice tinged with both fear and curiosity. "But people say he's the only one who can save us. They'll do anything to be seen by him." The figure of the plague doctor had become a grotesque symbol of both hope and despair. Despite his unsettling appearance, he was sought after by the desperate, the sick, and the fearful. These doctors were often called upon to visit the homes of the infected, to diagnose the disease, and to offer whatever remedies they could, even though they knew little about the true nature of the plague. The truth was, the plague doctors were not the medical experts they appeared to be. In fact, most of them were young, inexperienced, or simply opportunistic men looking to take advantage of the city's suffering. Medical knowledge was still rudimentary, based largely on ancient theories and superstitions. The idea that the plague was spread by bad air or miasma was the prevailing belief, and the plague doctors, armed with little more than folklore and rudimentary treatments, did what they could to alleviate the suffering of the infected. "Doctor, you've got to help me," one desperate man pleaded as he entered the small, dimly lit room of a plague doctor's office. "My wife is dying, and the fever's worse every hour." The plague doctor, standing near the doorway, turned slowly. His beak mask glinted in the dim light, a sharp and unsettling shape in the shadows. The man could see only the cold, unfeeling eyes through the round lenses of the mask, but they were enough to make him shiver. "What is the illness?" the doctor asked, his voice muffled by the mask. He stepped forward, his hands reaching for his instruments, a long metal rod, a bag of herbs, and a collection of vials filled with various concoctions. "It's the fever," the man said desperately. "It came on so fast, and now her body is covered with these horrible lumps, the buboes. Please, you must help her." The doctor nodded, though his gaze remained impassive. He didn't speak again, instead turning toward the table where he prepared his remedies. In the corner of the room, the man's wife lay fevered and delirious, her body racked with shaking fits. The doctor approached her bed, holding a leather-bound bag filled with herbs and powders. He began to prepare a mixture, unaware that his treatment would do little more than drain the woman's energy, as most of these remedies did. The man watched helplessly as the doctor began his ritual of bloodletting. It was a common practice at the time, based on the ancient belief that illness could be purged by removing blood from the body. The doctor used a sharp knife to make small cuts on the woman's skin, draining a few ounces of blood in an attempt to balance her humors. The woman screamed weakly as the blood poured from the cuts, her body trembling with the effort to stay conscious. "Why is she bleeding?" the man asked, his voice shaking. "Will it help?" The doctor's response was clinical, devoid of empathy. "Bloodletting restores balance to the humors. It will give her body a chance to fight the disease." His tone was cold and impersonal, as though he were reciting something he had memorized rather than actually engaging in a healing process. But the man could see the truth in his wife's eyes. There was no hope left in them. He didn't understand how the bloodletting could help her. He didn't understand why the doctor was doing it. But he was desperate, and so he stood there watching as the plague doctor continued with his strange, outdated methods. Each procedure felt more like an act of ritual than of healing. And yet for many of the poor and desperate in London, the plague doctor was their only hope. Though the remedies were ineffective, and the plague continued to ravage the city, the figure of the doctor, however grotesque, became a symbol of authority, of expertise, and above all, of survival. Mary and Jane had heard the rumors that the plague doctors were becoming more common, walking through the streets, moving from one house to another, their beak masks stuffed with herbs and spices to ward off the bad air. People would pay anything they could to see a doctor, even if they knew that the cure was unlikely. "Do you think they help?" Jane asked one day, as the two women sat by the window, watching another doctor pass by. "I don't believe they can save anyone, but they make people feel like they have a chance." Mary nodded slowly, her face pale from worry. "I don't know if they can save anyone, but people trust them. They trust the mask, the herbs. It gives them something to hold on to. But the truth is, She hesitated, looking out at the fog-filled streets. "We all know what's coming. The doctors, it seemed, were a necessary evil. They were feared and revered, but ultimately ineffective. In truth, many of them were simply guessing. They were walking the fine line between trying to offer hope and realizing that there was little they could actually do to stop the disease from spreading. Their masks were a form of protection, not from the plague, but from the psychological toll of the sickness. The public relied on them, despite their lack of understanding about what the plague truly was. Over time, some doctors began to see their role less as healers and more as record keepers. They would go from house to house, noting the symptoms, counting the dead, and adding their numbers to the grim tally of the plague's toll. In a sense, they became little more than grim bureaucrats in a city already dying. And yet, despite their apparent incompetence, the plague doctors became the symbol of an era that was struggling to understand an unstoppable force. They were men trapped between fear and superstition, attempting to use the only tools they had to fight an enemy they didn't truly understand. For the citizens of London, the plague doctor's visit was both a hopeful sign and a terrifying reminder of the disease that hung like a dark cloud over the city. The plague was relentless, and no matter how much people tried to fight it, there seemed to be no escaping its grip. The doctors in their beak masks remained a figure of grim necessity, a symbol of the fight for survival in a city that was slowly succumbing to death. Mary and Jane, like many others, continued to live in the shadow of the plague, watching the doctors come and go, offering their dubious treatments in hopes of saving the few who might still have a chance. But for Mary, the question remained: what could they really do to survive? The plague doctor's arrival had become a ritual, but it was no longer a solution, only a bitter reminder of the helplessness that had overtaken London. The silence of London was deafening. The city that had once been filled with the noise of commerce, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the calls of street vendors, and the laughter of taverns now lay eerily still. The usual hum of life had been replaced with the incessant tolling of church bells, marking another death, another soul lost to the plague. And through this silence, the slow, mournful sound of the death cart's wheels became a constant presence. It wasn't the sound of a cart that was unfamiliar to Londoners. Carts had always moved through the streets transporting goods, people, and supplies. But this was different. This cart, a simple wooden vehicle pulled by a horse, was no ordinary delivery. It carried bodies, the dead piled high in an unceremonious heap, wrapped only in ragged sheets, or sometimes nothing at all. The bodies, many of them bloated and discolored, were piled one on top of the other, a grotesque procession of death moving through the streets. "Bring out your dead." The cry rang out monotone and unfeeling as the death cart passed each house, a chilling announcement of its arrival. The words were not shouted with urgency, but recited as though part of a daily routine. The voice of the cart driver was devoid of emotion, its very nature an acknowledgement of the inevitability of what had become routine. The dead were no longer individuals, but part of a grim tally that had long since surpassed the point of compassion. In the cramped and suffocating homes, families lived in terror of hearing that call. There was no ceremony, no respect. The dead were taken often with no final farewell. The bodies, once the lifeblood of the people, were now nothing more than husks, their memories swept away with the passing of the cart. Inside these homes, the air was thick with the scent of decay and fear. Many had lost not just loved ones, but their ability to mourn. Isolation had become a constant companion, a cold reminder that death had come for them all, regardless of rank, wealth, or status. "Ma, what's that noise?" Little Thomas whispered to his mother, clutching her side as the distant sound of the death cart grew louder. He had not seen his father in days, not since the fevers took him. His small face was pale with worry. But his mother, pale and exhausted, herself could only shake her head, her heart heavy with dread. "They're coming for him, aren't they, Ma?" Thomas asked again, his voice barely more than a tremor. The mother's heart broke as she stroked his hair, but she could not bring herself to answer. She could not say the truth, not with her son's innocent eyes so full of fear. She had watched her husband Samuel slip away without a sound, his body slowly succumbing to the plague's deadly grasp. There had been no ceremony, no comfort for her as she sat by his side, watching his breath slow and his body grow colder. She had been forced to wrap him in a sheet, the only thing left to cover him, and wait for the death cart to arrive. When it did, she opened the door and saw the familiar face of the cart driver, a man whose expression she had come to dread. His face was covered by a cloth, and his eyes were hollow, having long since been emptied of emotion. He had grown accustomed to his grim task, and the sight of families torn apart by the plague no longer seemed to affect him. Without a word, the cart driver took the body of her husband, hoisting it onto the cart, its weight barely registering in the driver's practiced hands. The cart, already weighed down by other bodies, creaked under the strain, but the driver made no effort to make it more respectful, more careful. "Bring out your dead." The driver called once more, his voice as monotone as ever. And with that, the body of her beloved Samuel was gone, taken without ceremony, without even a moment for her to say goodbye. Her tears fell silently as she closed the door behind her, her son still clutching at her waist, oblivious to the crushing grief she felt. There was no comfort. There was no time to grieve. The city, overrun by disease, had no place for such things. Only survival remained. In another part of the city, the sound of the death cart was met with the same sense of hopelessness. In the parish of St. Giles, a place where death was no stranger, the daily procession of bodies had become an almost mechanical operation. The residents here had long since grown used to the sight of death. People had died in the streets, their bodies left to rot as the plague spread unchecked. But this time, the disease was different. It was more deadly, more ruthless, and it had spread too far to be stopped. "Another one gone," muttered a man named William as he watched the cart pass by. His wife, too, had succumbed to the plague, and now it was his turn to endure the same fate. The once bustling streets were now empty, the sound of the death cart filling the silence. "Do you think there'll be an end to it?" William asked no one in particular. His words were lost to the wind as the cart rumbled past him, the dead stacked high in its wooden bed. He watched them go, the familiar cry echoing in his ears as his thoughts turned dark. He could not help but wonder how many more would follow, how many would be buried without ceremony, without memory. The death cart had become part of the daily landscape of London, a symbol of the city's suffering and the helplessness of its people. It moved through the streets like a grim procession, the bodies taken one by one, swallowed up by the cart, and lost to the city's collective memory. Families were left behind, stranded in isolation, watching as their loved ones were carted away without so much as a prayer. The poor were the most vulnerable, of course, but no one was exempt from the plague's reach. The fear, the panic, the sense of impending doom spread through the city like wildfire. The rich fled, seeking refuge in their country estates, leaving the poor to fend for themselves in the city's crumbling streets. But even in the countryside, there was no guarantee of safety. The plague had a way of creeping into even the most remote villages, carried on the very winds that once brought the sweet scent of blooming flowers. In these desperate times, survival meant little more than waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the knock on the door, the pale face of the cart driver, and the sound of the cart's wheels grinding to a halt outside. It meant waiting for death to come, not with a final blow, but with a quiet, persistent certainty. The death cart, once an ordinary means of transport, had become a symbol of terror. It had come to represent the city's struggle against a force it could not understand, a force that had turned London into a living nightmare. It was a constant reminder of the plague's reach, of the suffering and grief that had consumed the city. And as the cart passed through the streets, carrying the bodies of the dead, it carried with it a sense of finality, a reminder that for so many, there would be no escape, and yet for all the despair and the terror that surrounded them, the people of London could not help but hope. Hope that the plague would eventually fade. Hope that somehow they would survive. But the death cart's wheels kept turning, a reminder that hope alone was no match for the relentless power of the plague. The city was dying, but it was not yet dead. And in the shadows of its crumbling walls, the people clung to the only thing left: survival. The cries of the death cart, the tolling of church bells, and the silence that followed them would become the soundtrack of London's suffering for years to come. But in the end, London would rebuild itself stronger and more resilient for having faced the darkness of the plague. The death cart's wheels would cease their terrible role, but the memory of the plague and the people it took would never be forgotten. In the thick of London's plague-ridden summer of 1665, panic had grown to unimaginable proportions. The once bustling streets of the city had turned into ghostly avenues where the cries of the dead mingled with the hushed whispers of the living, each person carrying the heavy weight of dread on their shoulders. The plague, which had crept into the city unnoticed, had now become a violent force sweeping through the population without mercy. The air itself seemed thick with fear, and every corner of the city became a place of suspicion and paranoia. As the death toll mounted, a terrible anxiety gripped the authorities. The city, now on the brink of collapse, demanded action. In their desperation to control the invisible enemy that had infected London, the city's leaders turned to a solution that was as misguided as it was extreme. They set their sights on a target that they believed could hold the key to stopping the spread of the plague: the city's animals. "It's the dogs and the cats," muttered one of the officials, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and certainty. "They are the ones spreading the disease. We must destroy them before it's too late." The belief was rooted in superstition, a misguided attempt to understand the plague, which was still an enigma to the medical minds of the time. The authorities, desperate for answers, fell into the trap of paranoia and fear. They believed that the animals, particularly dogs and cats, were somehow responsible for spreading the plague. Perhaps they thought it was the animals' contact with the infected rats, or their wandering through the city's alleys, that made them vectors of the disease. The order was given. The executioners, a mix of city guards and hired hands, were sent into the streets, their task clear and horrific: to kill every dog and cat they encountered. The animals, once beloved companions, were now seen as enemies of the people, part of the same dark force that had brought the plague to London. A blanket edict was issued calling for the mass slaughter of dogs and cats with little regard for the consequences. In a matter of days, thousands of these animals were captured, killed, and discarded in the streets. "Kill them, all of them," shouted one of the men, his voice hoarse with exhaustion as he pulled a mangy dog from a poor woman's doorstep. The woman, clutching her child to her chest, protested weakly, her face pale with fear. But that dog is not sick. He's just my companion." The man's eyes, dull with the weight of his task, offered no comfort. "I don't make the rules, madam," he said flatly, before dragging the dog away. "The king demands it. They're all to be killed." Across the city, the scene played out in similar ways. People's homes, once filled with the warmth of pets and the occasional friendly purr or bark, were now places of mourning. Families who had once found solace in their animals now found their companions ripped from their arms, slaughtered without reason. The authorities' message was clear. Animals were the enemy, and their destruction was necessary for the survival of the city. But the unintended consequences of this mass extermination quickly became apparent. As dogs and cats were killed off, the rat population, previously kept in check by their natural predators, exploded. The rats, long carriers of the disease, through their fleas, had thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of London. With the removal of their natural enemies, the rats found even more fertile ground to multiply. "You've killed the dogs." "And the cats," said Thomas, a dock worker, to his neighbor, a fellow tradesman. "But look around you. The rats are everywhere. They're in the walls and the food stalls. They're burrowing into the foundations of our homes." The neighbor, whose own dog had been taken and killed by the authorities, nodded grimly. "I thought they were supposed to stop the plague. All they've done is make it worse." Indeed, the people's desperation to find a scapegoat had led them to miss the true culprits. The rats, once kept at bay by the presence of their natural predators, were now free to roam the city unchecked. They scurried through the streets into home stores and markets, bringing with them the very fleas that carried the deadly plague. And while the authorities believed they had taken a step toward ridding the city of the disease, they had in fact made the situation worse. The plague continued its relentless march, now aided by the unchecked rat population. The death toll rose steadily each day, seeing more bodies added to the already overflowing graveyards. The people, already weakened by fear and despair, now faced the reality of a city under siege by both disease and its own leaders. "I saw them today," whispered Mary, a young woman who had lost her mother to the plague just days before. She spoke in hushed tones as though afraid to be overheard. "Rats, hundreds of them. They're everywhere, crawling over the dead bodies in the streets. And no one is doing anything about it." Her companion, a man named John, who had once worked as a blacksmith, nodded grimly. "They've killed the dogs, killed the cats. But it was the rats that brought the disease in the first place. What do they think they've accomplished?" It was a tragic irony. The authorities, in their blind panic and fear, had hoped to curb the plague by eliminating what they believed were its carriers. But instead, they had only exacerbated the problem, allowing the rats to thrive and spread the disease even further. The rats in their burrows and nests continued to host the fleas that carried the bacterium, their life cycles in full swing, despite the best efforts of those who had been tasked with containing the disease. And the people, they were left to suffer in silence, watching as the plague's grip tightened around them. They saw the city's once vibrant life slowly crumble under the weight of disease and fear, and yet they remained powerless to stop it. They had been abandoned by their leaders, their homes torn apart, by an unseen enemy. And now, they watched as the disease continued to claim their loved ones. The blame for the plague's spread did not fall on the rats, of course. It could not be the fault of the creatures that had always inhabited the city. No, the blame was placed elsewhere, on those who were easiest to scapegoat, the animals that had been vilified not for their role in the disease, but because they had been the most visible symbol of the crisis. The authorities, in their haste to appear as though they were taking control, had destroyed the very creatures that might have helped keep the situation in check. And in doing so, they had made a bad situation worse. As the plague continued to spread, the sense of paranoia among the people only deepened. Fear, once reserved for the invisible enemy, has now turned toward the people's neighbors, their friends, their families. If they could blame the animals, why not blame each other? What was to stop them from pointing fingers and accusing those who were still alive of being infected, of bringing the plague upon them all? In the streets, fear turned to anger. They've killed our dogs and cats, and now we're left with nothing. One man shouted from his doorstep, gesturing wildly as he watched the rats scurry across the street. They've taken our protectors and left us to die. No one is safe now, another voice called out. It's the rats, not the cats. The authorities are blind to the truth. The air was thick with fear, with distrust, and with the bitter realization that the people had been led astray. The authorities' attempt to control the plague had only deepened the sense of chaos in the city, making it harder for the people to fight what seemed like an unstoppable force. And as London's streets grew quieter and emptier, with families hidden behind shuttered windows, the rats continued their silent, unnoticed march, their fleas still carrying the deadly plague waiting for the next victim. The people of London had been caught in a web of fear and superstition, and in their desperation to make sense of the disaster, they had turned on the very creatures they once shared the city with, thinking that in doing so, they could stop the death that seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. But it was too late. The rats, once banished to the shadows, were now the city's true rulers, and the plague had claimed its first victim, humanity's ability to think rationally in the face of disaster. The plague had spread its invisible grip throughout London, seeping into every corner, every alley, and every home. The once vibrant city had transformed into a shell of its former self. It was a place where fear hung in the air, thick and suffocating, just like the smoke from the countless bonfires meant to purify the city. The streets, which had once been filled with the hustle and bustle of everyday life, were now eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of the dead carts rolling through their wheels, creaking under the weight of the dead. For those who remained in the city, survival had become a daily struggle. People no longer greeted each other with warm smiles or even a simple nod. Instead, they avoided one another, crossing to the opposite side of the street to prevent any chance of contact. A cough, a sneeze, a simple touch, anything could be a death sentence. Fear ruled their every action. It wasn't just the fear of the plague itself, but the fear of what the plague had done to them, to their city, to their lives. There was no safety, no respite. The city had become a prison, not of bars and walls, but of fear and suspicion. "Stay away from me," a woman shouted as she backed away from a neighbor who had been out shopping for food. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror. "I heard someone coughing in the street. You don't know who's sick anymore." The neighbor, who had been on her way to buy bread, paused, confused and hurt by the reaction. She had lived next door to this woman for years, shared meals and stories, but now she was nothing more than a threat. "I'm fine," she protested, but the woman had already turned her back, walking hurriedly away. Life, once filled with community and togetherness, had become a cold, isolating affair. The plague had bred mistrust between friends, family, and neighbors. The simple act of a handshake or a hug, once so natural, had become anathema. Even looking someone in the eye for too long could be perceived as dangerous. Every interaction, every glance was scrutinized for signs of illness. It was no longer about the sickness itself, but the unbearable terror of what it might mean if someone, anyone, had been touched by it. "Do you think they're all gone now?" asked Thomas, a weary merchant, as he stood in the doorway of his house, looking across the street at his neighbor's home. It had been marked with the Red Cross for days, and no one had come out. His wife Sarah shook her head, her expression tight with worry. "I can't bear to think about it. They were good people, Thomas, but no one is coming back from that." The fear had infiltrated every thought, every conversation. It wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about keeping the plague away from you, from your loved ones. And so the first instinct, the human instinct, was to protect oneself, to push others away, even those closest to you, out of fear of what they might carry, whether they were sick or not. It wasn't just the infected that were isolated. The living had become isolated from each other as well. Neighbors no longer offered a cup of sugar or a kind word. Instead, they holed up inside, hiding behind closed doors, windows shut tight against the world. Social norms, once taken for granted, broke down one by one. "Have you heard about old Mr. Collins?" whispered a man in the market, his voice low and conspiratorial. "They say his whole family died last night. Everyone's talking about it. But they've locked up the house. No one's going near it, not even the priest." "Why?" asked his companion, his voice betraying a mix of fear and curiosity. "They say it's the plague," the first man replied, his eyes darting around nervously. "But no one's saying it out loud. We can't risk it. If they say it's the plague, they'll shut up the whole block. No one will be able to trade. No one will be able to leave." The very idea of saying the word plague out loud had become taboo. It was a death sentence, not just for the sick, but for the living as well. To be associated with the plague was to be cast out of society. People feared the mark of the Red Cross on a door more than they feared the disease itself. Once that mark appeared, it wasn't just the house that was condemned. It was everyone who had been near it. The fear that had already gripped London was only growing. As the days passed, people began to take matters into their own hands. They barricaded themselves in their homes, praying that they would survive the night. Those with any means left, fleeing to the countryside, abandoning their homes, their businesses, their families. But for the poor, there was nowhere to go. No means to escape the city, no way to hide from the invisible threat that loomed over them. For them, survival meant living in a constant state of fear, always waiting for the next cough, the next fever, the next symptom to strike. "It's going to be all right, love," Samuel said, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke to his wife, who sat silently in the corner of their small, dimly lit room. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her, but the weight of their situation hung heavily in the air. "We'll make it through. We just have to stay inside, stay safe." She didn't answer immediately, her eyes cast downward. "How do you know? How do you know that we'll survive, Samuel?" Her voice cracked the strain of the situation too much to bear. She was afraid, not just of the disease, but of the isolation, the despair that had set in like an invisible fog. She had heard the same comforting words over and over, but they didn't feel true anymore. "I don't know, Ellen," Samuel admitted softly. "I don't know, but we have to try. We have to hold on." The city's breakdown wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual as well. People were worn thin by the constant fear, the ever-present threat of death hanging over them. They had lived through sickness before diseases had always been a part of life in London, but nothing compared to this. Nothing had ever gripped the city so completely, so relentlessly. The idea of survival had shifted from a matter of disease to one of willpower. Could they endure the terror? Could they face the prospect of losing everyone they knew? Of being abandoned by their leaders, their neighbors, their families? The plague was not just killing people, it was breaking them down, stripping away the social fabric, and turning communities into something unrecognizable. Survival had become a solitary affair. Families were forced to isolate themselves to protect what little they had left. The streets, once teeming with life, were now quiet, empty, save for the occasional passerby. Eyes down, hands clutching their cloaks tightly around them. The city had become a prison, each person trapped in their own small world, trying to keep the plague out, trying to keep their loved ones alive, trying to survive the despair that threatened to engulf them. "I saw it today," whispered another voice in the market, barely audible over the clinking of coins and the rumble of carts. A man just walking along like any other day. But his face, it was just so empty, like he knew he was already dead. The people of London were becoming numb. Fear had stolen their ability to mourn. They couldn't grieve the dead properly, for there were so many. The living were lost in a haze of self-preservation, no longer able to separate their fears from their daily lives. They had become shadows of themselves, disconnected from the city they had once known. And in the midst of all this, the Red Cross continued to be painted on doors, marking the death of one more family, one more home. The sound of the death cart, which had once seemed distant and unfamiliar, was now a regular part of the landscape, the mournful cry of the cart driver, signaling the end of another life, another family, another hope. In this landscape of fear, survival wasn't just about escaping the plague. It was about surviving the breakdown of everything that had once defined life in the city. In London, as the plague continued to claim its victims, the true test of endurance was no longer about the body, but about the soul. The death carts, their wheels creaking under the weight of the dead, had long become a fixture of London's tortured streets. Day after day, they rumbled along the cobblestones, collecting the lifeless bodies of men, women, and children, their faces gaunt and their limbs limp. The sound of the driver's cry, "Bring out your dead," echoed down alleyways, a grim reminder of the plague's merciless toll. In homes, families huddled together in fear, too afraid to even leave their houses for the necessities. Some never left at all. They waited, prayed, and watched their loved ones fall one by one. But winter, with its biting chill and winds that seemed to cut through bone, began to do what the city's feeble efforts could not. It slowed the spread of the plague, not by design, but by nature's cruel hand. The icy breath of winter brought some semblance of relief. Where once the disease thrived in the warm summer months, now the cold seemed to freeze the plague in its tracks. The fleas that had carried the bacteria and the rats that hosted them began to disappear, their movements slower, their activity stilled by the dropping temperatures. Slowly, as if the very fabric of the city itself was taking a collective breath, the city's heartbeat began to slow. The streets, once empty and echoing with the sound of the dead cart's wheel, started to feel less oppressive. But for the people who had lived through the plague, the damage was done. In the houses that had survived, a bitter quiet remained. No one could forget what they had lost, what had been stolen from them. London was a city of ghosts, ghosts of the families who had vanished, the businesses that had shut their doors, the vibrant streets that had fallen silent. The scar of the plague, like a deep wound, would remain forever etched in the heart of the city. In the cold of early winter 1665, the toll of the plague began to taper off. Though it seemed to vanish from the surface, its shadow stretched long and far. The official records, which were to give an account of the loss, began to list death numbers that were shockingly low compared to the real tragedy. The bills of mortality, official documents listing the causes of death, spoke of a mere 68,596 deaths attributed to the plague. But this number, while grave, did not tell the whole story. It did not account for the thousands of bodies left uncounted, for those who had died alone, their deaths never recorded. It did not include the poor families whose deaths went undocumented, or the deaths of those who had fled the city only to succumb to the plague in the countryside. It was a sanitized figure crafted to give the impression of control. But the truth hidden behind the figures was far worse. "We'll never know the real number, will we?" murmured Thomas, a man whose family had survived the worst of the plague. He stood in the remains of what had once been a bustling marketplace, his eyes cast downward at the abandoned stalls. He had come to collect what little goods were left, but the silence here, the emptiness, filled him with an unshakable sense of dread. The markets were slowly reopening, but it was not the same London. "No, we won't," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of months of grief. She wiped her hands on her apron, looking around at the devastated surroundings. "But what do we do now, Thomas? How do we rebuild?" Her question was one that many had asked in those days after the plague had finally ebbed. The question echoed through the empty streets, through the minds of the survivors. What now? How could the city begin to heal when the wounds ran so deep? It was not just the physical toll on the bodies. It was the psychological cost. The trauma that clung to every corner, to every street. London was forever changed. The streets, which had once been so full of life, now seemed quieter than ever. There was a lingering emptiness, a silence that hung in the air like a shroud, a silence that was broken only by the occasional scuffle of feet, the soft murmur of conversations that were still cautious, still tinged with fear. The survivors were like ghosts too, moving through the city, unsure of their place in a world that had changed so dramatically. But life, as it always does, began to push through the cracks. Slowly, cautiously, the businesses began to reopen. The merchants who had remained came back to their stalls, though they did so warily, their eyes always scanning the streets as if waiting for something to happen. The wealthy who had fled began to trickle back, their homes still intact, but the damage to their spirits irreparable. Those who had left during the plague, the ones who had the means to escape, now returned with a different perspective on the city they had abandoned. They had escaped death, but they could not escape the memories of what they had left behind. "You think they'll ever be the same?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the bustling yet subdued marketplace. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She took a deep breath, as if weighing the question in her mind. Finally, she said, "No, it can't be the same. Not after everything that happened. Not after losing so many." "And yet," Thomas said quietly, his voice tinged with something like hope, "we're still here, aren't we? We're still standing." Sarah looked at him, her expression softening. "We are. But for how long?" That was the question. Wasn't it? For how long? The city might have survived. But what about its people? How could they rebuild when the memories of death and loss were still so fresh? How could they move forward when they were haunted by the ghosts of the plague? The physical city might have been rebuilding, but the spiritual wounds ran deep. The scars left by the plague were not just in the dead, but in the survivors as well. Those who had lived through the fevered days of death, through the horror of watching loved ones fall one by one, were never quite the same. They had lived through something that could not be easily forgotten. It was more than just the loss of a loved one. It was the loss of a way of life, a loss of the sense of safety that once existed in the city. Even as the city began to breathe again, to rebuild its structures, the emotional toll of the plague lingered. People moved through the streets, but they did so quietly, cautiously, as though any moment could be the next wave of disaster. The joy of the future seemed so far away, overshadowed by the reality of the past. But slowly, the city did rebuild. New businesses opened, the markets grew louder, with life in the city began to take on a new shape, both physically and emotionally. The once overcrowded homes were replaced by more spacious buildings. The streets were widened and sanitation was improved. The memory of the plague, though still fresh in the minds of the survivors, began to fade into history. The lessons learned during the darkest days of the epidemic laid the foundation for future improvements in public health, urban planning, and the regulation of disease. In time, the Great Plague of 1665 became a memory, a dark chapter in the city's long history. But the scars remained hidden in the cracks of the city, in the stories of the survivors, in the buildings that had risen from the ashes. London had survived, but it had been forever changed. For the survivors, the future seemed uncertain, but they had lived through the unthinkable. They had endured the plague, and now they would endure the rebuilding of their world. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, there was a quiet hope that somehow they would find their way forward as a city and as a people. The winter had come, and with it the plague had been quelled. But the true cost of the epidemic, the emotional, psychological toll it had taken on London, was something the city would carry with it for generations to come. The ghosts of those who had fallen in the plague would remain forever in the city's memory, a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. The Great Plague of 1665 had left a devastating mark on London. The once thriving metropolis, full of life, commerce, and bustling streets, had been transformed into a ghost town, its heart ripped out by the relentless death toll. More than 100,000 people had perished their lives, stolen by an invisible enemy that crept through the city, leaving a trail of suffering and despair. The sheer magnitude of loss was incomprehensible. Families, neighborhoods, and communities were fractured as the city mourned not just the dead, but the future that had been lost. The survivors, those who had managed to outlast the fever, found themselves in a world that seemed unrecognizable. The streets, once filled with the sounds of market vendors, street performers, and merchants shouting their wares, were now eerily quiet. The once bustling neighborhoods had been emptied, the windows of countless homes broken or boarded up. The public spaces, pubs, churches, and theaters were abandoned, their doors sealed shut by fear. Even the grand structures, like the Royal Exchange and St. Paul's Cathedral, stood in mute testimony to the devastation. The city had not just lost people, it had lost its sense of itself. But as the plague waned and the worst of the summer heat passed, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. Londoners had lived through an unspeakable horror, one that changed them in ways they could not fully understand. Their world had shrunk. The gap between the living and the dead was now a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Families that had once shared meals now sat in silence, haunted by the absence of those they had lost. Even the familiar sights of the city, the marketplaces, the street vendors, the busy docks felt foreign. The very streets they had once walked so confidently were now filled with a lingering dread, a reminder of how fragile life truly was. In the aftermath, the city began to rebuild, but it was a reconstruction of both brick and soul. The physical rebuilding of London began with a sense of urgency as the city had to return to business as usual. But the emotional and psychological rebuilding was far more complex. The scars of the plague were not just in the ruined homes or the graveyards that had once been neighborhoods, but in the hearts of those who had lived through it. The survivors carried with them the weight of the deaths they had witnessed, the family members they had lost, and the trauma of living through the daily nightmare of the plague. The long-term effects of the plague were felt in the very fabric of London society. The city's response to future public health crises was forever altered by the events of 1665. The idea of quarantine, which had been implemented with such desperate ineffectiveness during the plague, became a central part of the city's defense against disease in the years to come. Public health measures, although rooted in a flawed understanding of disease transmission, began to take shape, and the importance of sanitation hygiene and the management of the urban environment became more apparent. London would never be the same. Urban planning, too, saw significant changes. The fire of 1666, though a disaster in itself, provided an opportunity to rethink the city's layout. The medieval maze of narrow streets and timber-framed buildings was replaced bit by bit with more spacious, fire-resistant structures. The overcrowded tenements that had provided fertile ground for the spread of the plague were eventually replaced by brick and stone houses, each designed with an eye toward better ventilation and sanitation. The lessons of the plague, though painful, had taught the city's leaders that a more organized, health-conscious approach to urban development was necessary. Yet despite these advances, the cost of the plague could never be erased. Londoners had lived through something that could not be easily forgotten. The survivors carried with them the emotional scars of the lives lost, the friendships shattered, and the sense of security that had been ripped away. In the years that followed, the collective memory of the plague remained a dark undercurrent in the city's psyche. It shaped the way people viewed illness, death, and survival. London was forever altered by the Great Plague. Even as the city rebuilt itself physically, economically, and socially, it could never fully escape the shadow of the plague. The survivors, though they had endured, were left to grapple with a city that had been irrevocably changed. The scars of the plague were not just etched into the walls of the city, but into the hearts of those who had lived through it. They had witnessed the destruction of a society, the collapse of the old ways, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding. But in the face of all this suffering, there was also resilience. London had survived. It had faced the worst of human history, and though the scars were deep, the city continued to live. For the people who had endured the plague, the question was not just how to rebuild the city, but how to rebuild their lives. The journey forward was long, and the healing process would take generations. But through it all, the survivors found a way to move on. Not because the pain had vanished, but because they had no other choice. London, scarred, but still standing, had weathered the storm.